Every person watching this knows one thing, with absolute certainty. One day, you will die. Not statistically, not eventually, in some abstract way, physically, personally, completely. And yet, your brain cannot truly picture it. You can imagine darkness. You can imagine sleep. You can even imagine floating outside your body, watching yourself disappear. But the one thing you cannot experience in your imagination is the total absence of experience itself. The moment you try, there is still a you there imagining it. That's where this gets disturbing. Because modern physics, neuroscience, and consciousness research have not made death simpler. They've made it stranger, much stranger. Scientists can now monitor dying brains in real time. They've recorded sudden bursts of intense activity after the heart stops. They've found signs that the brain may remain active longer than we thought. Meanwhile, physics tells us information may never truly disappear from the universe at all. And then there's the bigger problem nobody can solve: consciousness itself. Science can explain stars, atoms, black holes, even the beginning of the universe, better than it can explain why you are aware right now. So, when awareness finally ends, what exactly disappears? That question has terrified philosophers, physicists, neuroscientists, and ordinary people for centuries. And the deeper science goes, the less comfortable the answers become. Humans do something strange when it comes to death. We know it's unavoidable, but we spend most of our lives acting like it belongs to other people. You see it in everyday behaviour. People avoid writing wills until the last minute. They avoid hospitals unless necessary. Entire industries exist to make ageing look less visible. Even language changes around death. Instead of saying died, people say passed away, as if the mind naturally softens the idea before it even reaches consciousness. And neuroscience suggests there may be a reason for that. Your brain is built to protect your survival. Every major system inside it is focused on keeping you alive long enough to reproduce, avoid danger, and continue functioning. Fear helps with that. Pain helps with that. Anxiety helps with that too, even when it becomes excessive. But fully accepting your own non-existence creates a problem the brain cannot easily solve. Because if your mind completely accepted that you are temporary, fragile, and guaranteed to vanish, it could interfere with the very survival instincts evolution spent millions of years building. Some psychologists believe humans manage this conflict through what's called terror management theory. The basic idea is simple. Civilization itself may partly exist to distract us from death. Religion, legacy, status, family, achievement, even culture, all of them help people feel connected to something larger and more permanent than themselves. And honestly, you can see evidence of that everywhere. People want their names remembered. They want children. They build companies, monuments, books, online identities. Some freeze their bodies after death, hoping future technology might revive them. Others dedicate their lives to religion because the alternative feels unbearable. But underneath all of it is the same problem. The brain can imagine almost anything except its own absence. Try it honestly for a second. Imagine being unconscious forever. You can't really do it. The moment you attempt it, there's still an observer inside the thought. There's still a point of view, experience in the imagination. Even when people picture nothingness, they usually imagine darknesses, silence, or floating in empty space. But darkness is still a visual experience. Silence is still something being perceived. True non-existence has no observer. That creates a strange, philosophical trap. Every experience you've ever had has happened from inside consciousness. So your brain has no framework for understanding what it means for consciousness itself to stop. This becomes even stranger when you look at modern neuroscience. Your experience of reality is not direct. Your brain constructs it. Right now, your mind is generating a model of the world from electrical signals, memories, predictions, and sensory input. Colours are interpretations. Sound is interpretation. Even your sense of time is partly constructed by neural processing. In other words, the reality you experience is already a controlled simulation created inside the brain. And that raises a disturbing possibility. If consciousness is a constructed experience, then your entire sense of self may be more fragile than it feels. Neuroscience has shown that specific injuries can erase personalities, alter morality, destroy memories, or split awareness in bizarre ways, damage certain brain regions, and someone may stop recognizing their own family, damage another area, and they may feel detached from their own body. Under anesthesia, consciousness can disappear completely for hours with no sense of time passing at all. One moment exists, then nothing, then suddenly awareness returns. That alone makes death harder to think about, because it forces an uncomfortable question. If consciousness can switch off so completely under anesthesia, what exactly makes normal awareness feel so permanent? Physics complicates this even more. For centuries, death seemed relatively simple scientifically. The body stops functioning, the brain shuts down, consciousness ends. But modern physics introduced ideas that made reality itself less intuitive than anyone expected. Time is not absolute. Matter is mostly empty space. Particles behave probabilistically. Information may never truly disappear. At the quantum level, reality does not even behave in fully deterministic ways. None of this proves consciousness survives death. That's important to say clearly. But it does mean science no longer sees reality as a straightforward, mechanical system people once imagined. And the deeper researchers study consciousness, the stranger the problem becomes. Because despite all modern technology, nobody can fully explain why brain activity produces subjective experience at all. Scientists can map neurons, track electrical patterns, and identify regions linked to emotional memory, but there is still no complete explanation for why any of that feels like something from the inside. Why does electrical activity become awareness? Why are you not just processing information like a computer, but actually experiencing existence? That question sits at the center of the fear of death, because before you can understand what dies, you first have to explain what consciousness is, and science still can't fully do that. Most people imagine death as a single moment. 1 second, you are alive, the next second you are gone. But biologically, death is not that clean. Your body does not shut down all at once. It collapses in stages. That matters because modern medicine has forced scientists to rethink what death actually means. And the deeper researchers looked, the blurrier the line became. For most of human history, death seemed easy to identify. If someone stopped breathing and their heart stopped beating, they were dead. Simple. But in the 20th century, life support machines complicated everything. Doctors discovered they could restart hearts. They could artificially maintain breathing. They could keep organs functioning even when massive parts of the brain were destroyed. Suddenly, the old definition no longer worked. Today, science separates death into multiple categories. The first is clinical death. This happens when the heart stops beating and blood circulation ends. Oxygen no longer reaches the brain. Without intervention, unconsciousness usually begins within seconds. But clinical death is not always permanent. If CPR or defibrillation restores circulation quickly enough, people can survive. Some patients have even returned after several minutes without a heartbeat, especially in cold environments when metabolism slows down. Then there is brain death, which is very different. Brain death means the complete and irreversible loss of all brain function, including the brainstem. At that point, the body may still appear alive, temporarily, with machines assisting circulation and breathing, but the person is legally and medically considered dead. And then there's cellular death, which continues long after both of those stages. This is the part most people never think about, even after the organism dies. Individual cells inside the body do not instantly die with it. Different tissues shut down at different speeds. Skin cells can remain alive for hours. Bone cells may survive even longer. Certain genes continue activating after death, especially genes linked to inflammation, stress response, and cellular repair. In some studies, researchers found gene activity continuing for more than 24 hours after death in animals. Some genes even became more active than they were during life. That sounds disturbing, but it makes biological sense. Cells do not know the person has died. They only respond to local chemical conditions. As oxygen disappears and systems collapse, cellular mechanisms continue reacting until energy completely runs out. Death, in other words, is less like flipping off a light switch and more like a city slowly losing power district by district. First, transportation stops, then communication systems fail, emergency systems activate. Finally, individual neighbourhoods go dark one by one. The brain follows a similar pattern. It consumes enormous amounts of energy constantly. Even though the brain makes up only about 2% of body weight, it uses roughly 20% of the body's energy supply. Neurons are extremely sensitive to oxygen loss. Within seconds of interrupted blood flow, electrical activity becomes unstable. Within minutes, damage begins spreading rapidly. But even here, the process is not perfectly immediate. Recent studies have shown that some brain activity can persist briefly after cardiac arrest. In certain cases, neurons may remain capable of limited function, longer than researchers previously expected. That does not mean consciousness survives indefinitely, but it does mean the boundary between life and death is biologically messy, and that creates ethical problems medicine still struggles with today. For example, organ transplantation depends on precise definitions of death. Remove organs too early, and the patient may still have residual brain function. Wait too long, and organs become unusable. Doctors therefore rely on extremely strict criteria when determining brain death. They test reflexes, breathing response, brainstem activity, and electrical function. The standard exists because medicine understands something important. Death is not always visually obvious. There are also rare cases that deeply unsettle people because they expose how fragile our assumptions are. Under extreme cold, some patients have survived after extraordinarily long periods without measurable heartbeat because low temperatures slowed cellular damage. In one famous case, a woman in Norway survived after her body temperature dropped below 14 degrees Celsius. Medically, she appeared almost impossible to save, yet she recovered. Cases like this forced emergency medicine to adopt a saying, "Nobody is dead until warm and dead." That sentence sounds strange, but it reflects a major scientific reality. Biological systems are more flexible than we once believed. At the same time, there are limits. Without oxygen, widespread brain damage eventually becomes irreversible. Neurons lose membrane stability. Toxic chemical cascades spread through tissue. Networks responsible for memory, identity, and awareness break apart physically. And once those structures are destroyed beyond recovery, current science sees no known mechanism capable of restoring the original conscious person. That may sound obvious, but emotionally, humans resist accepting it because our minds experience consciousness as continuous and indivisible. In reality, biology shows something colder. The self depends entirely on physical processes that can slowly fail piece by piece. Your memories require active neural networks. Your personality depends on chemical signaling. Your sense of identity relies on fragile electrical patterns maintained every second by living tissue. Death reveals something uncomfortable about consciousness. It is not a fixed object hidden inside the brain. It is an active process, constantly being sustained, and processes can stop. One of the strangest discoveries in modern neuroscience is that the dying brain may not go quiet immediately. In some cases, it becomes unusually active. That idea sounds backwards. Most people imagine death as a steady fade into darkness, like a machine slowly losing power. But recordings from cardiac arrest patients and animal studies suggest the final moments may involve intense bursts of organised brain activity and nobody fully understands why. When the heart stops, blood flow to the brain collapses almost instantly. Oxygen levels begin falling within seconds. Under normal conditions, neurons depend on a constant energy supply to maintain electrical stability. Without it, communication between brain cells starts breaking down rapidly. For years, scientists assumed consciousness simply disappeared during this process. But over the last 2 decades, researchers started noticing something unexpected in EEG recordings in certain dying brains, especially shortly after cardiac arrest. There were sudden spikes in synchronized high-frequency brainwaves called gamma oscillations. Gamma waves are usually associated with conscious awareness, attention, memory integration, and active perception. In healthy brains, they appear when different regions communicate intensely with one another. So seeing these patterns appear during the early stages of death raised uncomfortable questions. In 2013, researchers studying rats observed a brief but dramatic surge of organised neural activity immediately after cardiac arrest. In some measurements, the activity temporarily exceeded normal waking levels. More recently, similar patterns have been reported in humans. In a few rare hospital cases, patients connected to EEG monitors showed bursts of gamma activity around the time of death. One widely discussed case involved an elderly epilepsy patient whose brain activity was recorded during cardiac arrest. Researchers observed coordinated oscillations in regions associated with memory retrieval and conscious processing. Now, it's important not to exaggerate what this means. Scientists are not claiming proof of an afterlife or consciousness surviving death. These recordings are limited, rare, and difficult to interpret. A dying brain can produce chaotic electrical behavior for many reasons. But the findings matter because they challenge the older assumption that the transition into death is neurologically simple. Instead, the brain may enter a temporary hyperactive state as its systems destabilize. Some neuroscientists compare it to a massive electrical cascade. As oxygen disappears, inhibitory neurons begin failing before excitatory neurons do. Normally, inhibitory neurons help regulate and suppress excessive activity. When they stop functioning, large networks may suddenly fire uncontrollably. The result could be an intense flood of internal experience generated by a brain in crisis. The possibility connects directly to near-death experiences. Across cultures and time periods, many people revived after cardiac arrest report surprisingly similar experiences. They described tunnels, bright lights, out-of-body sensations, encounters with deceased relatives, or overwhelming feelings of peace. Others describe life reviews, where memories appear to unfold instantly and simultaneously. Skeptics argue these experiences can be explained biologically. Lack of oxygen can distort perception. Neurotransmitters released during extreme stress may alter awareness. Certain drugs can reproduce some aspects of near-death experiences artificially. Ketamine, for example, can trigger sensations of detachment from the body and altered reality. And there's another important detail. Many near-death experiences probably occur before complete unconsciousness or during the process of regaining awareness, not necessarily during total brain inactivity, but some reports remain difficult to dismiss completely. A few cardiac arrest survivors have described details from resuscitation attempts that they supposedly should not have perceived while unconscious. Most cases are anecdotal and debated heavily, but they continue attracting scientific attention because they expose a deeper problem. Researchers still do not fully understand how consciousness breaks apart under extreme conditions. The timing itself is also mysterious. Subjectively, some people report experiences that feel enormously long despite occurring during very short periods of real time. This may relate to how the brain processes memory during trauma. Under extreme stress, the brain can encode information more densely, creating the impression that time expanded. You may have experienced a mild version of this already. During accidents or emergencies, people often say everything felt slowed down, but physical time did not change. Brain processing changed. Near death may push that effect to an extreme level. If neural systems become hyperactive and disorganized simultaneously, the boundary between memory, imagination, emotion, and perception could collapse. The brain might generate entire sequences of experience within seconds, and this leads to one of the most unsettling possibilities of all. From the outside, death may appear almost instantaneous, but from inside, the collapsing brain, subjective experience could behave very differently. Nobody knows how long awareness truly persists during the dying process. Measuring consciousness directly is extraordinarily difficult because consciousness is private by nature. Researchers can only observe indirect signals like electrical activity, blood flow, and patient reports after recovery. That uncertainty leaves room for fear, not necessarily fear of punishment or an afterlife, but fear of what the final moments themselves might feel like. Because the evidence increasingly suggests the brain does not simply switch off cleanly. It struggles, it surges, it destabilizes. And during that instability, consciousness may become stranger than at any other moment in life. One of the strangest parts of dying may have nothing to do with pain or fear. It may have to do with time itself, because the human brain does not experience time the way clocks measure it. Your sense of time is constructed moment by moment inside neural systems that constantly process memory, attention, emotion, and prediction. What feels like a smooth flow from past to future is actually the brain stitching together countless fragments of information into a continuous experience. And under extreme conditions, that system can break in very strange ways. You've probably already experienced small examples of this. During boring situations, time feels slow. During exciting moments, hours disappear almost instantly. In emergencies, people often report time dilation, where events seem to unfold in slow motion. But physical time did not slow down. Your brain changed how it processed information. Researchers think this happens partly because high adrenaline situations force the brain into an intense state of attention. Memory encoding becomes denser. More details get stored per second. Later, when the brain reconstructs the event, it feels longer because there is more information packed into the memory. That's important because dying brains may enter similarly extreme states. As oxygen drops and neural systems destabilize, the normal mechanisms responsible for organizing experience begin failing. Memory, perception, emotion, and self-awareness may stop operating in clean sequence. Instead of processing reality in an orderly timeline, the brain may generate fragmented or accelerated internal experiences. This could help explain why many near-death survivors describe experiences that feel timeless. Some say entire life reviews occurred in moments. Others describe entering states where past, present, and future no longer seem separated. A few report sensations that felt infinite, despite only minutes passing externally. Neuroscience offers possible explanations for this without requiring anything supernatural. Your sense of duration depends heavily on stable neural coordination. If those systems become disrupted, subjective time can stretch, collapse, fragment, or even disappear completely. And there's already evidence the brain can create radically distorted time perception under normal conditions. Certain drugs dramatically alter the experience of time. Psychedelics can make minutes feel endless. Dream states can compress long narratives into short bursts of sleep. Under anesthesia, hours vanish instantly because the brain stops forming continuous conscious memory. One moment you are awake, then subjectively, there's nothing. Then awareness returns with no sense that time passed at all. That gap is deeply unsettling when you think about death, because it suggests your experience of existence depends entirely on the brain continuously generating a sense of temporal continuity. Without that process, time from the inside may effectively disappear, Physics complicates this even more. In everyday life, time feels absolute. Seconds seem universal. But Einstein showed that time is flexible. According to relativity, time can move at different rates, depending on gravity and velocity. Astronauts experience tiny amounts of time dilation compared to people on Earth. Near massive gravitational fields, time slows dramatically relative to distant observers. Around black holes, the effect becomes extreme. This means time is not a fixed cosmic clock running identically everywhere. It is woven into the structure of space and motion itself. Now, relativity does not imply consciousness survives death, but it does destroy the intuitive idea that time is simple and universal. Your personal experience of time is already subjective neurologically. Physics then tells us even objective time behaves differently depending on perspective. And together, those ideas create a disturbing possibility. The final moments of consciousness may not feel brief from the inside. Imagine a system struggling to maintain awareness while its normal time processing mechanisms collapse. Thoughts could fragment, memories could overlap, seconds could stretch unpredictably. The brain might generate what feels like enormous spans of experience during very short physical intervals. Nobody knows for certain. This is one of the hardest areas to study scientifically because dying conscious experience is mostly inaccessible from the outside. Researchers can measure brain activity, but they cannot directly observe subjective awareness itself. Still, some neuroscientists speculate that the transition into unconsciousness may not be smooth at all. It could involve rapidly changing states of awareness, confusion, hyperlucidity, or dreamlike immersion. And there's another uncomfortable detail. Your experience of the present moment is already delayed slightly. The brain takes time to process sensory input and assemble conscious awareness. What you perceive as now is actually a constructed representation generated fractions of a second after events occur. In other words, consciousness already lives slightly behind reality. Normally, the delay is so small you never notice it, but it reveals something important. Your experience of existence is not reality directly. It is a model produced by the brain. If that model begins collapsing during death, normal rules of experience may stop applying altogether. This is where fear enters the conversation. Not necessarily fear of eternal punishment or supernatural judgment, but fear of uncertainty. Fear that the final transition may involve experiences impossible to predict, because the systems creating reality itself are breaking apart in real time. And unlike almost every other human experience, nobody can fully return from complete death to describe what happens after the process finishes. There's only the threshold, and science increasingly suggests that threshold may be far stranger than simple darkness. There's a reason conversations about death eventually run into the same wall. Nobody knows what consciousness actually is. That sounds impossible at first. Humans have mapped the human genome, landed probes on distant planets, and detected gravitational waves from black hole collisions, billions of light years away. Modern neuroscience can scan living brains in real time and identify regions involved in language, fear, memory, and decision-making. And yet the most immediate thing any human has ever experienced, awareness itself, still has no complete scientific explanation. This is what philosophers and neuroscientists call the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems of consciousness are things like explaining behavior, sensory processing, memory formation, attention, or sleep cycles. Those are difficult scientifically, but they are still mechanical questions. Researchers can study neurons, chemistry, and electrical activity to understand how the brain performs functions. The hard problem is different. Why does any of this activity feel like something from the inside? A computer processes information. So does your brain. But your brain does more than calculate. It produces subjective experience. You do not merely detect light wavelengths. You experience colour. You do not simply register pressure waves in air. You hear sound. You feel emotions, Pain hurts. Fear feels terrifying. Love feels real. Why? That single question may be one of the deepest unsolved problems in science. Neuroscience has become extremely good at identifying correlations between brain states and conscious experience. Researchers know certain brain regions activate during visual perception. Other networks are involved in self-awareness, memory integration, and emotional processing. Damage those systems and consciousness changes dramatically. But correlation is not explanation. Imagine scientists perfectly mapped every electrical signal in the brain. While you looked at the colour red, they could identify every neuron involved. They could predict your behaviour. They could even reproduce the exact pattern artificially. There would still remain a mystery. Why does that process produce the experience of redness at all, instead of happening in the dark, like a computer calculation? Some philosophers call these inner experiences qualia, the raw feeling of conscious awareness. And qualia are deeply strange because they cannot be directly observed from outside. You can study another person's brain activity endlessly, but you can never access their subjective experience itself. You can only infer that it exists because they behave similarly to you. That creates a scientific problem, unlike almost anything else in physics or biology. Consciousness is simultaneously the most familiar thing humans know and the hardest thing to measure objectively. And this matters enormously when discussing death, because before science can explain what happens to consciousness when you die, it first has to explain what consciousness is during life. Right now, there is no universally accepted answer. Some researchers believe consciousness is an emergent property of sufficiently complex information processing. In this view, awareness arises naturally when neural networks reach certain levels of integration and self-modeling. Others think consciousness may depend on specific biological structures or chemical processes unique to living brains. A few scientists and philosophers argue something even more radical, that consciousness may not be fully reducible to physical computation at all. That last idea remains controversial, but the fact it is seriously debated shows how incomplete current understanding still is. Part of the difficulty comes from how unified consciousness feels subjectively. Right now, your senses, memories, emotions, and thoughts all seem combined into one continuous experience. You feel like a single observer, located behind your eyes, experiencing reality in real time. But neuroscience suggests that unity may be partly constructed. Different brain regions process information separately and at different speeds. Visual information, sound, body sensation, and emotional response are handled by distributed systems that must somehow synchronize into one coherent awareness. No single consciousness center has ever been found. Instead, consciousness appears to emerge from vast networks interacting dynamically across the brain. The self may not be a fixed object at all. It may be an ongoing process, continuously assembled from moment to moment, and processes are vulnerable. Anesthesia can erase consciousness temporarily. Brain injuries can radically alter personality. Certain seizures can split awareness into fragmented states. Neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's slowly dismantle memory and identity over time. All of this suggests consciousness depends heavily on physical brain function. But dependence is not the same as explanation. Scientists can identify conditions necessary for consciousness without fully understanding why conscious experience exists in the first place. This gap creates enormous tension in modern science. Physics explains matter, chemistry explains molecular interactions, biology explains living systems, neuroscience explains neural mechanisms. But somewhere between neurons firing and subjective awareness appearing, there is still an unanswered question, and death forces that question into the open. Because if consciousness is entirely generated by physical processes, then destroying those processes should end awareness permanently. But if consciousness involves principles science does not yet fully understand, then the picture becomes less clear. That uncertainty is what makes the topic so unsettling. Not because science has proven mystical ideas, but because even now, with all modern technology, humanity still cannot fully explain why the universe contains conscious experience at all. And until that mystery is solved, the true nature of death remains partly unresolved too. For most neuroscientists, the explanation for consciousness is ultimately physical. Your thoughts, memories, emotions, identity, and awareness are not separate from the brain. They are what the brain does. That view is called materialism, and in modern science, it remains the dominant position for one simple reason. Every known change to consciousness can be altered by changing the brain itself. Damage the brain, and the mind changes. The pattern appears everywhere in neuroscience. A small stroke can erase language. A tumour can completely alter personality. Degenerative diseases can slowly dismantle memory until loved ones become unrecognisable strangers. Chemicals can dramatically shift mood, perception, and identity within minutes. Even a tiny electrical stimulation applied to certain brain regions can trigger emotions, memories, or hallucinations artificially. To many scientists, this evidence points toward a straightforward conclusion. Consciousness is generated by physical neural activity. And if that is true, then death has terrifying implications, because when the brain permanently stops functioning, the conscious self would stop too. Not migrate, not continue invisibly, simply end. That conclusion feels emotionally brutal, because human experience does not feel temporary from the inside. Awareness feels central and continuous. Most people move through life with an unspoken assumption that the self exists as something solid behind thought and perception. But neuroscience increasingly suggests the self is constructed. Your identity depends on memory integration, emotional continuity, sensory processing, and predictive modelling, all working together dynamically. There may be no permanent observer hidden inside the brain at all. Instead, the brain continuously generates the experience of being a self, and researchers have found startling evidence for this. In split brain experiments, patients whose brain hemispheres were surgically disconnected sometimes behaved as though two partially independent streams of consciousness existed inside one skull. One hand could respond differently from the other. One hemisphere could possess information the other lacked. This deeply disturbed neuroscientists because it suggested unified consciousness might be less stable than it appears. Then there are cases involving severe brain injury. A famous example is Phineas Gage, a railroad worker who survived an iron rod blasting through his skull in 1848. Before the accident, people described him as responsible and calm. Afterward, his personality changed dramatically. Friends reportedly said he was no longer Gage. That sentence captures something frightening. If changing physical brain structure changes the person, then personality may not exist independently from biology at all. Modern medicine sees this constantly. Frontotemporal dementia can transform caring individuals into impulsive strangers. Certain tumours have caused sudden criminal behaviour or disturbing compulsions that disappeared after surgery. Depression, psychosis, and memory disorders can radically alter a person's experience of reality. Even ordinary sleep reveals how dependent consciousness is on biology. Every night, your conscious awareness fades. Dreams distort identity and logic, then consciousness reassembles itself in the morning so smoothly that you rarely question it. Under anesthesia, the effect becomes even stranger. People describe general anesthesia as fundamentally different from sleep. During sleep, time still feels loosely connected. Under anesthesia, consciousness simply vanishes. There is no darkness or floating sensation, no awareness of time passing. One moment exists and the next, conscious moment arrives instantly hours later. Many neuroscientists see this as a preview of what death may be like. Not an experience of nothingness, but the absence of experience entirely. And that distinction matters. Humans naturally imagine death as being trapped in darkness forever, because the brain tries to represent non-existence as an experience. But materialist neuroscience argues there would be no observer left to perceive anything at all. The fear, then, may come less from death itself and more from the impossibility of imagining true absence. Still, there are unresolved problems even within the materialist view. Scientists can identify neural correlates of consciousness, the brain processes associated with awareness, but they still cannot fully explain why those processes generate subjective experience. The hard problem remains unsolved, but many researchers argue this gap does not require mystical explanations. Science has often understood mechanisms before fully understanding deeper principles. Humans used gravity long before Einstein explained space-time. Early biologists studied life before discovering DNA. From this perspective, consciousness may simply be another natural phenomenon the brain produces through sufficiently complex computation and integration. And if that's true, death becomes biologically final. No functioning neurons means no conscious processing, no memory integration, no self-model, no awareness. Just as a flame disappears when fuel and oxygen run out, consciousness would disappear when neural activity permanently collapses. For some people, this idea feels horrifying. For others, strangely peaceful, because if death truly ends consciousness completely, there would be no suffering afterward. No fear, no awareness of absence. The universe existed for billions of years before you were born, and you experienced none of it. Materialists argue death may simply return you to that same condition. But emotionally, humans resist this conclusion for a deeper reason. Consciousness feels too immediate, too personal, too alive to imagine as temporary machinery. People do not experience themselves as biological processes. They experience themselves as someone, and science has not yet fully explained why that illusion, if it is an illusion, feels so undeniably real. At some point, almost every discussion about consciousness runs into quantum mechanics, partly because quantum physics is genuinely strange, and partly because when science reaches something it cannot fully explain, people naturally look toward the strangest area of physics for answers. That's how quantum theories of consciousness became famous. The most well-known version comes from physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. Their theory is called ORC-SHOAR, short for Orchestrated Objective Reduction. The basic idea is controversial but fascinating. Penrose argued that human consciousness might involve quantum processes happening inside microscopic structures in brain cells called microtubules. These tiny structural components exist inside neurons and help maintain cellular organization. Hameroff proposed that microtubules could support delicate quantum states inside the brain, and this is where things become unusual. Quantum systems behave very differently from normal large-scale objects. Particles can exist in superpositions where multiple possible states exist simultaneously until interaction causes one outcome to emerge. Entangled particles can show correlations across distance that seem almost impossible intuitively. Quantum mechanics already challenged classical ideas of reality long before consciousness entered the discussion. Penrose believed consciousness might involve a special type of quantum state reduction linked to gravity itself. In ORC-SHOAR theory, conscious moments arise when quantum superpositions inside microtubules collapse in organized ways. In simple terms, the theory suggests awareness may not come entirely from ordinary neural computation. Instead, consciousness could involve deeper, quantum-level processes embedded in the structure of reality. That idea attracted huge attention because it sounded like a bridge between physics and subjective experience. but most neuroscientists remain skeptical. The biggest criticism is practical. Quantum states are incredibly fragile. In laboratories, maintaining quantum coherence usually requires extreme isolation and very low temperatures. The brain, by contrast, is warm, wet, noisy, and chemically chaotic. Critics argue quantum coherence would collapse far too quickly inside biological tissue to play a meaningful role in cognition. There's another issue too. Even if quantum effects occur in the brain, that does not automatically explain consciousness. Quantum mechanics is strange, but strange is not the same thing as conscious. Some researchers worry quantum consciousness theories sometimes become placeholders for mystery rather than actual explanations. Still, the topic refuses to disappear, partly because quantum mechanics itself contains philosophical puzzles that continue bothering physicists to this day. One famous example is the measurement problem. In quantum theory, particles exist as probability distributions until measurement forces a specific outcome. But what exactly counts as a measurement? Why does one possibility become reality while others disappear? Early interpretations occasionally involved conscious observation in ways that inspired decades of speculation, connecting awareness and quantum physics. Modern physics mostly avoids requiring consciousness in quantum measurement, but the historical connection left a lasting cultural impact. And honestly, quantum mechanics already sounds unreal enough without adding consciousness. Particles tunnel through barriers, entanglement links systems across distance. Virtual particles appear and vanish in empty space. Quantum fields fluctuate constantly, even in vacuum conditions. At the deepest levels, reality behaves less like solid objects, moving predictably, and more like mathematical probabilities interacting dynamically. That naturally tempts some people to ask whether consciousness might also operate differently than classical biology suggests, especially because a consciousness itself feels difficult to reduce into ordinary mechanics. There's also another reason quantum ideas remain attractive emotionally. If consciousness depends purely on classical brain activity, death appears final. But if awareness involves deeper quantum processes tied to fundamental physics, some people wonder whether aspects of consciousness could persist in ways current neuroscience does not understand. Important distinction here. There is no accepted scientific evidence that quantum mechanics allows personal consciousness to survive death. That idea goes far beyond what current data supports. Even Penrose himself has been cautious about exaggerated claims surrounding his theory. But quantum consciousness theories remain culturally powerful because they exploit a genuine scientific gap. Nobody fully understands how subjective awareness emerges from matter, and quantum mechanics represents the deepest known layer of physical reality humans currently possess. So people naturally try connecting the two mysteries together. There's also something psychologically unsettling about quantum theory itself. At everyday scales, reality feels stable and objective, but quantum physics suggests certainty may not exist fundamentally. Instead, probability sits at the core of nature. Events emerge from statistical possibilities rather than perfectly deterministic outcomes. For some physicists, this means consciousness may eventually require entirely new frameworks beyond current neuroscience. For others, it simply means the brain is an extraordinarily complex physical system operating according to known laws, even if humans do not yet fully understand all the details. Right now, there is no consensus, but what matters for the question of death is this. Modern physics has not produced a clear answer about consciousness either way. Quantum theories remain speculative. Materialist neuroscience remains incomplete. The hard problem still exists, and that uncertainty creates space for both hope and fear. Hope that consciousness may involve deeper principles not yet understood. Fear that humans may be searching for meaning inside randomness because the alternative, permanent oblivion, feels emotionally impossible to accept. Either way, the existence of these theories reveals something important about humanity itself. Even with modern science, people still struggle to believe awareness is merely temporary electrical activity inside fragile biological tissue. And until science fully explains consciousness, the question will remain open enough for strange possibilities to survive. Near-death experiences are one of the most uncomfortable subjects in science because they sit directly between neuroscience, psychology, and something harder to define. The stories are often deeply similar. People whose hearts stopped during surgery or cardiac arrest later describe leaving their bodies, watching doctors work on them from above, moving through tunnels, seeing bright lights, meeting dead relatives, or experiencing overwhelming peace. Others describe intense life reviews where memories seem to unfold all at once, emotionally and visually. And these reports appear across cultures all over the world. That alone doesn't prove anything supernatural. Human brains share similar biology, so similar experiences under extreme conditions are expected. But what unsettles researchers is how consistent certain patterns remain, despite differences in religion, language, and personal beliefs, especially because some people report experiences during periods when they were supposedly unconscious. Scientists have studied near-death experiences seriously for decades now, and the mainstream scientific position is cautious but clear. These experiences are real psychological events, but there is no verified evidence they prove consciousness survives death. Still, some details remain difficult to explain fully. One major challenge is timing. During cardiac arrest, blood flow to the brain drops rapidly. Within seconds, organized neural activity should begin failing. So, how does the brain sometimes produce vivid, structured experiences during periods associated with severe physiological collapse? One explanation involves the brain entering abnormal, hyperactive states before full shutdown. As discussed earlier, dying brains may produce bursts of synchronized activity during oxygen deprivation. Stress chemicals flood the nervous system. Memory systems destabilize. Sensory integration breaks apart. Under these conditions, the brain could generate intense, dreamlike experiences that feel completely real. This theory explains many aspects of near-death experiences well. Tunnel vision, for example, may result from oxygen loss, affecting peripheral visual processing first, leaving only central visual fields active. Bright lights may emerge from abnormal activity in visual cortex regions. Out-of-body sensations can sometimes be triggered experimentally through stimulation of the temporoparietal junction, a brain region involved in body awareness and spatial orientation. Even a feeling of peace may have biological explanations. During extreme stress, the brain can release endorphins and neurotransmitters that reduce pain and fear. Some researchers believe this may function as a protective mechanism during catastrophic injury, and yet some cases continue bothering scientists. There are reports of patients accurately describing details of medical procedures they supposedly could not perceive while unconscious. In a few famous cases, individuals described conversations, instruments, or events occurring during resuscitation attempts. Skeptics argue memory contamination, coincidence, prior awareness, or reconstruction after recovery can explain many of these accounts. Human memory is highly unreliable, especially under trauma. That's true. False memories happen constantly, but researchers studying near-death experiences point out that not every case fits neatly into ordinary hallucination models either. Some patients report unusually coherent experiences despite severe physiological impairment that should theoretically reduce organized cognition. This does not mean the experiences are supernatural. It means the neuroscience of dying consciousness may still be incomplete. One of the largest studies ever conducted on cardiac arrest survivors was the AWARE study led by physician Sam Parnia. researchers attempted to investigate whether conscious awareness could persist during resuscitation. The results were mixed and controversial. Most patients reported no memories at all. Some described vague experiences. A smaller number reported detailed conscious events. The study did not provide proof of consciousness existing independently from the brain, but it also did not fully close the discussion, and that uncertainty keeps the topic alive scientifically. Another reason near-death experiences feel so powerful is emotional intensity. People often describe them as more real than real. Colours appear vivid. Emotions feel amplified. Time behaves strangely. Some individuals return profoundly changed afterward, losing fear of death or re-evaluating their priorities entirely. This psychological impact is significant because ordinary dreams rarely produce such lasting transformations. Neuroscientists think this may relate to how emotionally charged memories become deeply encoded during extreme states. Trauma, altered neurochemistry, and intense emotional processing could create experiences that permanently reshape personal identity. But there's another unsettling possibility. Near-death experiences may reveal something disturbing about consciousness itself. Under certain conditions, the brain can generate entire realities internally that feel absolutely convincing. That idea matters far beyond death. Every conscious experience you've ever had already exists inside your brain as a constructed model. Near-death experiences may simply expose how flexible and unstable that model can become under extreme biological stress. And this raises an uncomfortable question. If the brain can produce experiences that feel utterly real while reality processing systems collapse, how confident can humans be about the reliability of conscious perception in general? Science still does not have a complete answer. What researchers do know is this: near-death experiences are not rare. Millions of people worldwide report them. They are psychologically profound, neurologically fascinating, and scientifically unresolved in important ways, not because they prove an afterlife, but because they expose how little humans still understand about the boundary between conscious awareness and biological death. And that boundary may be far stranger than earlier generations of scientists ever expected. One of the strangest ideas in modern physics is that information may never truly disappear. At first, that sounds unrelated to death, but once physicists realized how fundamental information is to reality itself, the question became unavoidable. If the information that makes up the universe cannot be destroyed, then what exactly happens to the information that makes up you? To understand why this became such a serious scientific problem, we need to talk about black holes. For a long time, black holes seemed simple. A massive star collapses under gravity until it creates a region so dense that nothing, not even light, can escape. Anything crossing the event horizon disappears forever from the observable universe. That included information. If you threw a book into a black hole, the details inside the book appeared permanently lost. Same for atoms, particles, memories, or entire planets. The black hole would keep growing, but the original information describing what fell in seemed erased completely, and that created a disaster for physics. Quantum mechanics strongly suggests information cannot actually be destroyed. The exact arrangement of particles and quantum states may change form, but the underlying information describing the system should remain preserved. This principle sits deeply inside modern physics, but black holes appeared to violate it. Then, in the 1970s, Stephen Hawking made things worse. Hawking discovered that black holes are not entirely black. Due to quantum effects near the event horizon, they slowly emit radiation and eventually evaporate over immense periods of time. This became known as Hawking radiation. Here's the terrifying part. Hawking's original calculations suggested the radiation carried no information about what fell into the black hole. If the black hole completely evaporated, the information would vanish permanently. Physics hates that conclusion, because if information can truly disappear, then quantum theory itself starts breaking down. This conflict became known as the black hole information paradox, and it turned into one of the biggest problems in theoretical physics for decades. Eventually, most physicists came to believe the information must survive somehow, even if humans do not yet fully understand the mechanism. Ideas involving holography, quantum entanglement, and space-time encoding emerged as possible solutions. Today, the dominant view is that information is preserved, though in extremely scrambled forms. And this is where people start connecting physics to consciousness. Not because physics proves an afterlife, it absolutely does not, but because information itself now appears more fundamental to reality than earlier generations realized. Modern physics increasingly describes the universe in terms of information, states, probabilities, and relationships, rather than solid material objects alone. Your brain, meanwhile, is also an information processing system. Memories are encoded patterns. Personality depends on neural organization. Consciousness appears linked to dynamic information integration across brain networks. So when a person dies, what actually disappears? The atoms do not vanish. The energy does not vanish. Even the information describing the physical particles technically continues evolving according to physical laws. But the organized structure that produced conscious awareness collapses. That distinction matters. Imagine a library burning down. The paper transforms into smoke, heat, and ash. The atoms still exist. Energy remains conserved, but the meaningful arrangement, the stories, knowledge, and structure is destroyed. Many neuroscientists argue death works similarly. The physical components survive in altered form, but the organized informational pattern, generating the conscious self, disintegrates irreversibly. And emotionally, that may be even more disturbing than simple annihilation, because it suggests you are not a permanent object. You are a temporary pattern, maintained by extraordinary biological complexity, a process, a structure, an arrangement of matter and information briefly capable of self-awareness before entropy tears it apart. Still, some physicists and philosophers wonder whether this picture is incomplete. If consciousness depends on information processing fundamentally, could sufficiently preserved information theoretically preserve aspects of identity? Could future technologies reconstruct minds from enough data? Could consciousness itself relate to informational structures more deeply than current neuroscience understands? Right now, these remain speculative philosophical questions, not established science, but they reveal something important about modern physics. Reality no longer looks like simple mechanical matter moving through empty space. Instead, information appears woven into the fabric of existence itself. Some theories even suggest space-time geometry may emerge from informational relationships at deeper quantum levels, and that changes how humans think about death psychologically. For centuries, people feared the destruction of the soul. Modern science replaced the soul with information patterns, neural structures, and physical systems. But the emotional question remains surprisingly similar. What does it mean for a conscious pattern to stop existing? Physics can describe matter transforming. It can describe entropy increasing. It can track particles across time, but it still cannot fully explain subjective awareness itself. So even though the brain may operate physically, the loss of conscious identity still feels philosophically mysterious, especially because your experience right now feels unified and singular, not like data processing. And perhaps that's the deepest fear underneath death. Not merely that matter changes form, everything in the universe already does that constantly. The real fear is that the unique pattern experiencing reality from your perspective may only happen once, and when the structure collapses, the observer disappears with it. Few scientific ideas sound more terrifying than quantum immortality, not because scientists think it's likely true, but because if it were true, death might become impossible in the worst possible way. The idea comes from one interpretation of quantum mechanics called the many worlds interpretation. To understand why this theory unsettles people so deeply, you first need to understand how strange quantum physics already is. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in probabilistic states. Before measurement, systems can behave like multiple possible outcomes exist simultaneously. Normally, when observation occurs, one outcome becomes reality. Traditional interpretations assume the wave function collapses into a single result. But in 1957, physicist Hugh Everett proposed something radically different. What if the wave function never collapses at all? Instead, every possible quantum outcome actually happens, just in separate branching versions of reality. In this picture, the universe constantly splits into countless parallel branches. In one branch, a radioactive atom decays. In another, it does not. In one branch you chose coffee this morning. In another, tea. Most of these differences would be microscopic and impossible to notice. But mathematically, the interpretation solves certain problems in quantum theory cleanly because it avoids mysterious wave function collapse entirely. And this is where quantum immortality appears. Imagine a deadly quantum experiment linked to a device. If a certain quantum event occurs, the device kills you instantly. If another outcome occurs, you survive. From an outside perspective, many branches exist. In some, you die. In others, you live. But subjectively, there is a disturbing implication. You can only experience branches where you remain conscious. In branches where you die, there is no observer left to perceive anything. Therefore, from your own perspective, awareness would always continue along surviving branches, no matter how unlikely survival becomes. This thought experiment became known as quantum suicide, and the resulting philosophical implication became quantum immortality. Again, this is not an accepted scientific prediction. Most physicists treat it as a bizarre consequence of certain interpretations rather than evidence about real human survival. But the idea spreads because it attacks the fear of death in a deeply unsettling way. Normally, death means consciousness ends. Quantum immortality suggests something stranger. Consciousness might never experience its own termination because awareness only continues in branches where survival remains possible. At first, some people hear this and think it sounds comforting. It is not comforting because the theory does not imply eternal youth, health, or happiness. It only implies continued subjective survival somehow. That could mean surviving accidents with catastrophic injuries, remaining alive in increasingly improbable states, existing through prolonged suffering because consciousness keeps following branches where biological function barely persists. The terrifying version of the idea is not immortality, it's inescapability. There's another major problem too. Quantum immortality depends heavily on assumptions about personal identity and consciousness that science does not actually understand. What counts as you continuing? If your brain changes radically after severe trauma, is that still the same observer? If consciousness fragments or deteriorates, does subjective continuity still apply? The thought experiment exposes something philosophers have struggled with for centuries. Human identity is harder to define than it seems. Still, many physicists reject quantum immortality entirely. First, the many worlds interpretation itself remains only one interpretation of quantum mechanics among several. It is mathematically serious and respected by many researchers, but it is not experimentally proven as a definitive explanation of reality. Second, even within many worlds, connecting branching universes to conscious experience involves philosophical assumptions beyond established physics. Quantum mechanics predicts probabilities for physical systems. It does not currently explain subjective awareness directly. And third, probability still matters. Even if many branches exist, overwhelmingly, most branches for any organism eventually involve death due to entropy, aging, or catastrophic physical failure. Quantum immortality does not magically prevent biological decay forever, but psychologically, the idea remains powerful because it weaponizes uncertainty itself. Humans fear non-existence, partly because consciousness cannot imagine its own absence. Quantum immortality twists that fear into a different nightmare. What if awareness never fully escapes experience at all? This is why the theory became so culturally fascinating online. It combines three deeply disturbing concepts at once. First, the idea that reality may constantly branch invisibly. Second, the possibility that consciousness has a strange relationship to survival probabilities. And third, the fear that subjective experience may be trapped inside continuity, even when objective reality says death occurred elsewhere. Again, there is no scientific evidence that humans actually experience quantum immortality. Most neuroscientists and physicists consider ordinary biological death exactly what it appears to be, the irreversible collapse of brain function. But the theory matters philosophically because it reveals how modern physics has destabilized common intuitions about reality itself. Before quantum mechanics, death seemed conceptually simple. Now even the structure of reality behaves in ways that challenge ordinary human understanding. And once physics stopped looking intuitive, people naturally began wondering whether consciousness and mortality might also be stranger than they appear. That uncertainty does not prove immortality, but it does guarantee one thing: the deeper humans investigate reality, the harder it becomes to feel completely certain about anything, including death itself. One of the most unsettling discoveries in neuroscience is that your consciousness may not be as continuous as it feels. Right now, you probably feel like the same person you were a minute ago, the same observer who woke up this morning, the same you that existed years ago. But the brain does not actually preserve experience as one uninterrupted stream. Instead, it constantly rebuilds reality in real time. Your perception of the world is assembled from fragments. Vision, sound, memory, emotion, body awareness, prediction, and attention are processed in separate neural systems operating at different speeds. The brain then synchronizes these signals into a single, coherent experience so smoothly that you never notice the construction process happening underneath. Consciousness feels seamless, partly because the brain edits out the seams. There's a famous experiment that reveals how artificial this continuity can be. Researchers discovered that people fail to notice surprisingly large changes in visual scenes if those changes occur during brief interruptions like blinking or eye movement. This phenomenon is called change blindness. Entire objects can disappear, faces can swap, backgrounds can transform, and people often miss it completely. Why? Because the brain is not recording reality like a video camera. It builds an approximate model based on expectation, prediction, and selective attention. Your experience of reality is already partly an illusion. And memory makes this even stranger. Most people think memory works like storage, where experiences are saved and replayed later. But neuroscience shows memory is reconstructive. Every time you remember something, the brain partially rebuilds the event from fragments rather than retrieving a perfect recording. The reconstruction process introduces distortions constantly. False memories can be implanted experimentally. People can become absolutely convinced events happened when they never did. Witness testimony, despite feeling reliable, is notoriously fragile. Even your personal identity depends heavily on these unstable memory systems. Think about what makes you you. Your body changes continuously. Most atoms inside your body are replaced over time. Your personality evolves, beliefs change, memories fade or become distorted, and yet consciousness creates the feeling of a stable self moving continuously through time. Some neuroscientists argue this feeling may itself be a kind of controlled hallucination generated by the brain, not hallucination in the sense of seeing imaginary monsters, but in the sense that the brain actively constructs the experience of being a unified person There may be no permanent self behind the process at all, only ongoing reconstruction. This becomes especially disturbing when you realise how often consciousness already disappears temporarily. Every night during deep sleep, large portions of conscious awareness shut down. Under anaesthesia, consciousness vanishes entirely with no perceived passage of time. During certain seizures, people lose continuity of awareness completely. And yet, when consciousness returns, the brain seamlessly stitches experience back together into the narrative of a continuing self. That narrative is powerful enough that humans rarely question it, but philosophers have for centuries. Some compared personal identity to a flame. A flame appears continuous, but it is actually a constantly changing process, fueled moment by moment by new chemical reactions. The pattern persists, even though the material changes continuously. Your consciousness may work similarly. At every instant, neural activity updates, reorganizes, and replaces previous states. The you reading this sentence is not physically identical to the you who started the paragraph. Brain chemistry, electrical activity, and informational states have already shifted. Normally, these changes happen gradually enough that continuity feels smooth, but neuroscience suggests continuity may be more psychological than absolute, and that matters deeply when thinking about death, because humans usually imagine death as a destruction of a stable, permanent self. But if the self is already a constantly changing process, then the boundary between continuity and disappearance becomes harder to define. Some philosophers push this idea to uncomfortable extremes. If consciousness is reconstructed moment by moment, what guarantees the observer, continuing through time, is literally the same entity, rather than a continuously updated version carrying memories forward? From the inside, continuity feels undeniable, but scientifically, the mechanism behind that continuity remains surprisingly unclear. This leads to a disturbing possibility. The self may not be a fixed thing, travelling through time. It may be more like an ongoing narrative the brain continuously generates. And narratives can end, or change, or fragment. Modern neuroscience already shows how fragile identity can become. Brain injuries, dementia, trauma, and neurological disorders can dramatically alter personality and self-perception. Some patients lose autobiographical memory entirely yet remain conscious. Others develop split perceptions of reality. Certain conditions even cause people to deny ownership of their own limbs. All of this suggests the self is not indivisible. It is assembled. An assembly can fail. This doesn't necessarily mean consciousness is unreal. Pain still hurts. Love still matters. Experience still exists. But the stable observer, humans intuitively imagine may be less solid than it appears. And that may partly explain why death feels so difficult to understand emotionally. Humans fear the destruction of the self, yet neuroscience increasingly suggests the self was never a permanent object to begin with. Instead, it may be a temporary process, balancing on top of fragile biological machinery, rebuilding itself every second until one day the reconstruction stops. For thousands of years, philosophers and spiritual traditions have questioned whether the self is real in the way humans assume it is. Modern neuroscience has started reaching disturbingly similar conclusions. One of the clearest examples comes from Buddhism. Long before brain scans existed, Buddhist philosophy argued that the permanent self is an illusion. According to this view, what people call I is actually a constantly changing collection of thoughts, sensations, memories, and perceptions, temporarily held together by the mind. There is no fixed observer behind experience. At first that sounds abstract, but neuroscience keeps uncovering evidence, pointing in a surprisingly similar direction. Take split brain patients. In severe epilepsy cases during the 20th century, surgeons sometimes cut the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of fibres connecting the brain's two hemispheres. The goal was to stop seizures from spreading between sides of the brain. The surgeries often worked medically, But psychologically, the results became famous because they exposed something deeply strange about consciousness. In some experiments, split brain patients behaved as though two partially independent minds existed inside one body. For example, information shown only to the right hemisphere could influence behaviour even when the speaking left hemisphere claimed ignorance. One hand might perform actions the other seemed unaware of. In some cases, the two hemispheres even appeared to prefer different choices. And yet subjectively, patients still felt like one person. This suggests the unified self-human's experience may be constructed after the fact by brain systems constantly stitching together fragmented processes into a coherent narrative. The brain may function less like a single commander and more like multiple systems negotiating continuously behind the scenes. Then there's the problem of memory. People often think identity comes from continuity of memory, but memory itself is unstable, selective, and partially fictionalized. Neuroscientists now know every memory changes slightly when recalled. The brain reconstructs experiences rather than replaying exact recordings. That means your autobiographical identity is partly built from edited stories your brain continuously rewrites, and the rewriting can become dramatic. Patients with severe amnesia sometimes lose vast portions of personal history while remaining conscious and emotionally responsive. Others confidently remember events that never occurred. False memories can be implanted experimentally with alarming ease. So, if memory changes, personality changes, and the body changes, what exactly remains constant? That question becomes even stranger in neurological disorders involving identity fragmentation. In dissociative conditions, people can experience disconnected self-states with different memories, emotional responses, or behavioural patterns. Under certain forms of epilepsy or brain injury, individuals may feel detached from their own thoughts or bodies entirely. Some patients report feeling like passive observers trapped inside themselves. Others deny ownership of limbs. A few even insist close relatives have been replaced by imposters despite recognising their faces correctly. All of this points toward a difficult conclusion. The self feels unified and stable because the brain actively creates that feeling, not because a permanent inner entity has been located scientifically. This doesn't mean consciousness is fake. Experience still exists. Awareness still happens. But the idea of a solid, indivisible you may be psychologically useful, more than biologically literal. And death changes meaning completely once you see the self this way. If the self is a fixed soul-like entity, then death seems like the destruction or migration of a permanent thing. But if the self is an ongoing process assembled from changing components, death may resemble the ending of a pattern rather than the destruction of an object. Some philosophers compare it to a whirlpool. A whirlpool looks stable and identifiable, but it is actually a temporary pattern formed by flowing water. The structure exists only while conditions maintain it. Once the motion stops, nothing physically leaves. The pattern simply no longer exists. Neuroscience increasingly suggests human identity may work similarly. Your sense of self emerges from dynamic brain activity, integrating perception, memory, emotion, and bodily awareness into a coherent experience. When those systems function together, the self appears stable. When they fragment, the self fragments too. And when biological activity permanently stops, the pattern disappears entirely. Emotionally, humans resist this idea strongly because subjective experience feels centered around a persistent observer. You feel like the same person moving through time despite enormous physical and psychological change. But science struggles to identify where exactly in there that observer exists. No single brain region contains the self. No stable consciousness particle has ever been discovered. Instead, awareness appears distributed, dynamic, and deeply dependent on physical processes. This creates a disturbing possibility. The thing humans fear losing in death may never have existed in the permanent form people imagine. Instead, personal identity may already be more fluid, temporary, and constructed than everyday consciousness allows us to notice. And perhaps that's why death feels psychologically impossible to accept, not just because humans fear pain or oblivion, but because the brain evolved to maintain the illusion of continuity. Survival depends on treating the self as stable and important. Without that narrative, motivation and meaning become harder to sustain. So consciousness constantly tells a story. You are one person. You persist through time. You are the same observer who existed yesterday. Neuroscience does not completely deny that story, but it increasingly suggests the story may be more fragile and stranger than humans ever wanted to believe. Most scientists believe consciousness emerges from physical brain activity, but not everyone agrees that matter alone fully explains awareness. And over the last few decades, a surprising number of philosophers, neuroscientists, and even some physicists have started exploring a possibility, once considered almost unthinkable. What if consciousness is not something the universe accidentally produced? What if consciousness is built into reality itself? One of the oldest versions of this idea is called panpsychism. The concept sounds bizarre at first, but the core argument is actually simple. Consciousness appears incredibly difficult to explain as something emerging suddenly from completely unconscious matter. So instead of assuming awareness magically appears once brains become complex enough, panpsychism proposes that some primitive form of experience may already exist at the most basic levels of nature. Not human thought, not intelligence, not emotions, just extremely simple forms of subjective existence woven into physical reality itself. In this view, consciousness would not be a rare accident. It would be a fundamental feature of the universe, like mass, charge, or space-time. Now, this does not mean rocks have thoughts or atoms feel emotions the way humans do. Serious panpsychists usually argue for something far more abstract, that the building blocks of matter may possess tiny proto-conscious properties that combine into richer forms inside complex systems like brains. Why would anyone take this idea seriously? Because the alternative remains deeply mysterious too. Materialist neuroscience can describe how neurons process information, but it still struggles to explain why information processing produces subjective experience at all. Panpsychism attempts to solve that problem by suggesting consciousness was never created from non-conscious matter in the first place. Instead, consciousness may already exist at some foundational level. Another controversial theory called integrated information theory, or IIT, takes a different approach. IIT argues consciousness corresponds to the amount of integrated information inside a system. According to this idea, awareness emerges when information becomes unified and irreducible in highly interconnected networks. The human brain would therefore generate rich consciousness because it integrates enormous amounts of information dynamically across billions of neurons. Simple systems would possess little or no consciousness. More complex systems would possess more. What makes IIT fascinating and disturbing is that it implies consciousness may not be exclusive to biological organisms. Under the theory, sufficiently integrated systems of any kind could possess some level of subjective experience, potentially including advanced artificial intelligence someday, or even the universe itself in certain interpretations. This is where discussions begin moving toward ideas that sound almost philosophical or spiritual, even though researchers attempt to frame them scientifically. Some physicists and philosophers have speculated that consciousness might relate to deep informational structures underlying reality. Others propose field-like models where awareness emerges from interactions extending or beyond individual neurons. Again, none of these theories are scientifically established facts. Most remain highly speculative and heavily debated. Critics argue theories like panpsychism risk explaining consciousness by simply assigning consciousness everywhere without predictive evidence. Others say IIT may confuse information processing with actual subjective experience. And many neuroscientists still believe standard biological explanations will eventually solve the hard problem without requiring radical new frameworks. But the existence of these debates reveals something important. Modern science still does not possess a complete theory of consciousness, and that uncertainty leaves room for ideas that would have been dismissed immediately a century ago. There's also a psychological reason these theories attract attention. If consciousness is fundamental rather than accidental, death may feel less absolute emotionally. People naturally wonder whether awareness tied to deeper structures of reality could persist in forms current neuroscience cannot recognize. Important distinction again, these theories do not provide evidence for personal survival after death. Even if consciousness were fundamental to reality, your individual personality, memories, and identity could still depend entirely on the brain and disappear when it dies. That's similar to how electricity exists fundamentally in nature, but a broken computer still stops functioning once its circuitry collapses. Still, these theories remain unsettling because they challenge a deeply ingrained assumption that consciousness is merely a side effect of chemistry happening inside skulls. Instead, they raise a different possibility. Maybe consciousness is not inside the universe. Maybe consciousness is part of what the universe is. Some philosophers compare this shift to earlier scientific revolutions. Humans once believed life required mystical forces until biology explained cellular processes. Others now wonder whether consciousness may eventually force another conceptual revolution in physics itself. Or maybe not. Maybe awareness truly is just what sufficiently complex brains do, and humans struggle emotionally to accept that because consciousness feels too important to be temporary. Right now, science cannot fully settle the argument either way, and perhaps that's what makes the topic so haunting. No matter how advanced neuroscience becomes, conscious experience still sits at the center of reality from the human perspective. Every scientific theory, every equation, every experiment is ultimately experienced through awareness itself. You can doubt the external world philosophically, you can doubt memory, you can doubt perception, but consciousness, the fact that experience is happening at all, remains the one thing humans encounter most directly. And after centuries of philosophy and decades of modern neuroscience, humanity still cannot fully explain why it exists. At some point, physics stops caring that you are alive. That sounds harsh, but from the perspective of thermodynamics, a living human being is an extremely temporary arrangement of matter fighting a constant battle against entropy, and eventually, entropy wins. To understand why death happens physically, you have to understand what life actually is. A living organism is not stable matter. Your body is a continuous process. Every second, cells repair themselves. Proteins fold and unfold. Neurons fire electrically. DNA replicates. And energy flows through biological systems with incredible precision. Life depends on maintaining order against the natural tendency of the universe toward disorder. The tendency is entropy. In simple terms, entropy measures how systems naturally spread out energy and move toward less organized states over time. A hot cup of coffee cools down, buildings decay, stars burn through fuel. Ordered systems require energy to maintain themselves. Your body is no exception. Right now, trillions of cells inside you are constantly preventing collapse through active maintenance. The heart circulates oxygen. The brain coordinates regulation. Cells repair molecular damage continuously. Specialized proteins detect errors and attempt corrections every second. Even with all this maintenance, damage still accumulates. DNA mutates. Proteins degrade. Cellular waste builds up. Repair systems weaken with age. Eventually, biological order becomes harder and harder to sustain. Death is what happens when the system can no longer resist breakdown. And once that process begins, physics takes over completely. Within minutes after circulation stops, oxygen levels collapse. Cells lose the energy required to maintain membrane stability. Chemical gradients fail. Enzymes leak from internal compartments. Tissues begin digesting themselves from the inside in a process called autolysis. Then bacteria enter the process. Your body already contains trillions of microorganisms while alive, especially inside the digestive tract. During life, the immune system and cellular barriers keep these populations controlled. After death, those systems fail. Microbes spread freely through tissue. Decay begins. Proteins break apart into simpler compounds. Fats decompose. Cells rupture. Molecules once organized into thoughts, memories, emotions, and identity become chemically indistinguishable from ordinary organic matter. And this is where death becomes emotionally difficult, scientifically, because physics does not recognize the difference between a living person and rearranged molecules once biological organization collapses. The atoms remain. The carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and phosphorus that once formed your body continue existing. They return to soil, atmosphere, bacteria, plants, oceans, or other organisms eventually. Matter recycles endlessly. But the organized structure, generating conscious awareness, disappears. That distinction may be the most painful part of materialist death. Nothing supernatural leaves the body visibly. No measurable, energy-carrying personality has ever been detected departing at death. From physics alone, the transition looks brutally mechanical. The system loses order. The pattern dissolves. Entropy increases. And yet life itself was always improbable. From a thermodynamic perspective, living organisms are localized pockets of temporary order, created by energy flow. The sun powers ecosystems. Ecosystems sustain biology. Biology creates minds, capable of reflecting on their own mortality. For a brief period, matter becomes conscious enough to fear its own dissolution. Then the process reverses. Some physicists find this strangely beautiful. Others find it terrifying, because thermodynamics treats every structure the same eventually. Civilizations decay, planets cool, stars exhaust fuel. Even galaxies evolve toward greater disorder over unimaginable timescales. Human beings are not exceptions to cosmic rules, and this creates a profound psychological conflict. Your conscious experience feels central and important. Subjectively, awareness feels like the most significant thing in existence, because every experience you've ever had occurred through it. But physics describes consciousness as an extremely temporary phenomenon, emerging from unstable biological organization inside a universe indifferent to personal meaning. That tension is hard for the human mind to accept, especially because daily life hides entropy effectively. The world around you appears stable. Your body feels continuous. Consciousness feels permanent enough that death seems distant, psychologically, even when understood intellectually. But thermodynamics never stops operating. Every heartbeat, every breath, every repaired cell is part of a continuous fight against disorder. Aging itself is evidence of that fight slowly failing, and eventually all the systems maintaining the self-collapse together. What remains afterward depends on perspective. Emotionally, humans see loss. Memories vanish, relationships end, identity disappears. Physically, the universe sees transformation. The atoms continue moving through cosmic cycles exactly as they always have. Carbon from dead stars became living tissue. Living tissue becomes future matter again. Nothing escapes the laws of energy and entropy. But this scientific picture creates a terrifying realization. The universe does not preserve meaning automatically. Meaning exists because conscious beings create it temporarily inside fragile biological minds. And once those minds disappear, the meaning disappears with them unless other minds continue carrying it forward. That may be one of the deepest truths Death forces humans to confront not merely that bodies die, but that consciousness itself may be a brief island of order surrounded by an indifferent universe, constantly moving towards silence. Human beings usually think about death on personal timescales, decades, maybe generations, if they think historically. But physics forces a much larger perspective, because eventually, not only will every person die, every civilization, every species, every planet, every star, and possibly every structure in the universe will disappear too. And once you start following that timeline forward, the future becomes almost impossible for the human mind to emotionally process. Let's start close to home. If your body is buried naturally, bacteria, insects, fungi, and chemical processes slowly break it down over years or decades, depending on conditions. The atoms that once formed your brain eventually scatter into soil, water, atmosphere, and living organisms. Some of those atoms may already have belonged to ancient plants, dinosaurs, extinct animals, or dead stars long before they became part of you. Matter recycles constantly, but Earth itself is temporary too. Right now, the Sun is roughly halfway through its stable lifetime. In about 5 billion years, it will exhaust the hydrogen fuel in its core and begin expanding into a red giant. As the Sun grows, temperatures on Earth will rise catastrophically long before the planet is physically consumed. Oceans will evaporate, the atmosphere will become unstable, complex life will almost certainly disappear. Eventually, the inner planets may be swallowed entirely. Everything humans ever built, cities, books, monuments, digital records, graves, satellites, will vanish. Not metaphorically, physically. Even if humanity survives, technologically somewhere else, Earth itself has an expiration date. Then there are the stars. Stars are not permanent lights. They are thermodynamic engines, slowly burning through nuclear fuel. Massive stars explode violently as supernovae. Smaller stars fade more quietly into white dwarfs. Over trillions of years, star formation throughout the universe will gradually stop as available gas becomes depleted, the universe will grow darker, galaxies themselves will also change. Collisions, black hole interactions, and cosmic expansion will slowly isolate structures from one another. Distant galaxies are already moving away faster and faster because of dark energy, the mysterious force driving accelerated expansion. Eventually, observers in far future galaxies may no longer even detect evidence that other galaxies ever existed. The observable universe will shrink effectively from their perspective, and then things become truly difficult to imagine. After stars die, the universe enters what physicists sometimes call the degenerate era. White dwarfs cool into black dwarfs. Neutron stars decay slowly. Planetary remnants drift through darkness for unimaginable spans of time. Black holes may become the dominant remaining structures. But even black holes are not eternal. Thanks to Hawking radiation, black holes slowly lose energy and evaporate over timescales so enormous they barely fit into language. A supermassive black hole may survive for around 10 to the power of 100 years before finally disappearing. That number is absurdly beyond ordinary human comprehension. And after the black holes evaporate, the universe may approach something called heat death. This is one of the bleakest concepts in cosmology. Heat death does not mean explosions or dramatic destruction. It means the gradual exhaustion of usable energy differences. Entropy reaches maximum levels. Matter becomes sparse. Temperatures approach uniformity. No organised processes capable of sustaining life, thought, or complex structure remain. The universe does not die violently. It fades. Stars gone, galaxies dark, particles drifting through near-empty space, colder and quieter than anything humans can imagine. And this creates a terrifying realization. Everything humans care about exists thick during an extremely tiny window of cosmic history. Life, consciousness, memory, civilization, art, love, fear, ambition, all of it appears during a brief thermodynamic moment. between the chaos of the early universe and the slow fading of cosmic energy. For a short time, the universe became complex enough to observe itself. Then eventually, the observers disappear. Some physicists speculate alternative endings could happen instead. Maybe dark energy changes over time. Maybe the universe collapses eventually in a big crunch. Maybe new universes emerge cyclically. But under current evidence, heat death remains one of the leading possibilities. And emotionally, it is difficult because it removes any illusion of permanence. Not only do individual humans die, even the cosmos itself may become incapable of supporting meaning or consciousness forever. This perspective can feel crushing, but strangely, some scientists find comfort in it too, because cosmic impermanence places human mortality into a larger natural process. Death is not a personal failure or cosmic punishment. It is part of the same thermodynamic reality governing stars, galaxies, and space-time itself. Everything changes, everything transforms, everything ends eventually. And perhaps the most unsettling part is this. The universe appears completely indifferent to that fact. Physics contains no built-in guarantee that consciousness matters cosmically. No known law protects civilizations from extinction or preserves memory forever. The universe allows beauty, awareness, and meaning to emerge temporarily without promising they will last, which means humans may be responsible for creating meaning themselves during the brief time consciousness exists at all. Because against the backdrop of cosmic time, every human life is unbelievably short. And yet for the person living it, that tiny fragment of time contains an entire universe of experience. Almost every human civilization in history developed some form of afterlife belief. Ancient Egyptians imagined souls travelling through the underworld. Greeks described Hades. Norse mythology had Valhalla. Hindu and Buddhist traditions developed ideas of reincarnation and rebirth. Christianity and Islam described heaven, hell, and eternal judgment. Even isolated cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years, often arrived at remarkably similar ideas. Death is not the end. That raises an uncomfortable question. Did humans discover something true, or did the human brain evolve in a way that makes belief in continuation almost inevitable? Modern psychology leans heavily toward the second explanation. Humans evolved as survival machines. The brain constantly predicts danger, searches for patterns, and models future outcomes to keep the organism alive. Over millions of years, evolution favoured minds that treated threats seriously, because underestimating danger usually had fatal consequences, and that produced side effects. One of the biggest is something called hyperactive agency detection. Humans naturally assume events are caused by intentional agents, even when they are not. Hear rustling in bushes, and your brain assumes something is there before confirming it. See faces in shadows, and the brain interprets patterns as people automatically. Evolutionarily, false positives were safer than false negatives. Mistaking wind for a predator wastes energy. Mistaking a predator for wind gets you killed. Psychologists think this same tendency contributed heavily to religious belief and afterlife concepts. Humans instinctively perceive agency, intention, and meaning everywhere. When someone dies physically, the emotional model of that person inside the brain does not disappear immediately. You still expect them to speak. You imagine conversations with them, sometimes grieving people, even report sensing their presence. Neuroscience suggests this happens because social cognition systems evolved to model other minds continuously. The brain does not instantly accept that a person who once possessed agency has become permanently absent. In a sense, part of the brain keeps simulating them. Children reveal this tendency naturally. Studies show young children often assume thoughts and emotions continue after death, unless explicitly taught otherwise. Intuitively, the human mind struggles to imagine consciousness ending completely. That fits with what we discussed earlier. Consciousness cannot easily imagine its own absence. There's also Another evolutionary reason afterlife beliefs may persist. Fear of death creates psychological instability. A species fully aware of inevitable extinction could become paralyzed by anxiety. Cultural systems that reduce existential fear may therefore provide survival advantages. Socially and psychologically, religion often offers exactly that. Meaning, structure, moral order, community, hope that suffering is temporary, reassurance that loved ones are not truly gone. Terror management theory argues that much of human civilization functions partly to protect people from awareness of mortality. According to this theory, humans cope with death anxiety through symbolic systems that create feelings of permanence. Religion is one version, legacy is another. People want children, achievements, reputations, monuments, art, or social impact, because these things create symbolic continuity beyond biological death. Even modern digital culture reflects this instinct. Humans archive photos endlessly, preserve messages, record videos, and build online identities, partly because the brain resists disappearance psychologically. People want traces of themselves to remain, and historically, belief in afterlife systems often strengthened social cooperation too. If people believe moral behaviour affects eternal outcomes, communities become easier to organise. Shared spiritual narratives create cohesion, trust, and identity across large groups. This does not automatically mean religions are false, of course. Psychological explanations for belief do not disprove spiritual claims. Humans also evolved to perceive mathematics and physical reality accurately enough to survive. Yet mathematics still describes real structures in nature. But neuroscience and evolutionary psychology strongly suggest the human tendency toward afterlife belief has understandable biological roots. The brain is not neutral about death. It is biased against accepting non-existence, and perhaps that bias was necessary. Imagine early humans fully internalizing the cosmic perspective we discussed earlier. Every person dies, civilizations vanish, stars collapse, and eventually, even the universe itself may fade into darkness. That level of existential awareness could become psychologically destabilizing without systems capable of creating meaning and emotional resilience. So humans created stories, some religious, some philosophical, some scientific. Stories about souls, reincarnation, legacy, destiny, ancestors, progress, or immortality through memory. And in many ways, civilization itself may partly be a giant collective response to mortality. Science changed the language, but not the emotional problem. Ancient humans feared spirits and judgment. Modern humans fear oblivion, entropy, and cosmic indifference. The details changed. The anxiety remained. Because underneath every philosophy about death sits the same emotional reality. Conscious creatures evolved powerful survival instincts, while simultaneously becoming intelligent enough to realize survival is temporary. That creates a contradiction the human mind still struggles to resolve. And perhaps that's why afterlife beliefs continue even in technologically advanced societies. Not because humans are irrational, but because mortality itself may be psychologically unbearable without some framework for meaning beyond individual death. Whether that framework is religious faith, scientific curiosity, family, art, love, or legacy, the function is often similar. It helps conscious beings continue living despite knowing the ending. And maybe that's one of the most human things about us. We know we are temporary, yet we keep building meaning anyway. For centuries, humans searched for immortality through religion. Now some people believe technology might achieve something similar instead, not through souls or afterlives, but through data. The idea is simple in theory and deeply disturbing in practice. If consciousness comes entirely from information processing inside the brain, then maybe a sufficiently advanced machine could copy that process. Maybe your mind could be uploaded. This concept is often called mind uploading or whole brain emulation. The goal would be to scan the brain in extreme detail, every neuron, every connection, every electrical and chemical pattern, and recreate that structure digitally inside a computer system. If the simulation behaved exactly like your brain, it might think like you, remember your life, speak with your personality, and claim to be conscious. At first glance, this sounds like technological immortality, but then a real philosophical problem appears. Would that actually still be you? Imagine a future machine scans your brain perfectly and creates an exact digital duplicate while your biological body remains alive. The uploaded version wakes up claiming to be you. It remembers your childhood, your fears, your relationships, your memories. From the outside, the copy seems identical, but your biological consciousness still remains in your original body. So which one is the real you? Most people instinctively answer both. But that creates a paradox. If two identical conscious versions can exist simultaneously, then identity may not be a single transferable thing at all. The upload would not continue your awareness. It would create a second conscious observer with the same memories up to the moment of copying, and from your own perspective, inside the biological brain, you would still face death normally. This problem becomes even more unsettling in teleportation thought experiments. Imagine a teleportation machine scans your body completely, destroys it atom by atom, and reconstructs an identical version somewhere else. The reconstructed person behaves exactly like you and insists continuity was preserved. But was it? Or did the original consciousness simply die while a perfect replacement appeared? From the outside, the distinction may be impossible to detect, but subjectively, it matters completely, because consciousness is experience from the first-person perspective, and science still does not know what creates continuity of subjective awareness across time. This is why mind uploading may not solve death at all. It may only solve replication. A copied consciousness could preserve your memories and personality for others, but your personal awareness might still end when the biological brain dies. Some philosophers compare this to identical twins. Twins may share genetics and similarities, but they are still separate conscious observers. A digital copy might simply become another branch of consciousness rather than preserving the original. And things become stranger once artificial intelligence enters the discussion. Modern AI systems already imitate conversation, creativity, and problem solving in ways that would have seemed impossible decades ago. As these systems improve, researchers increasingly debate whether advanced AI could someday become genuinely conscious rather than merely intelligent. Right now, nobody knows. AI can process information and generate convincing language without proven subjective awareness. But since humans still lack a complete theory of consciousness itself, scientists cannot confidently define the exact boundary between sophisticated computation and actual experience. If conscious machines eventually become possible, humanity faces disturbing ethical questions. Would digital minds fear death? Could software suffer? Would shutting down a conscious AI count as killing? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if consciousness can exist independently from biology, what makes humans special? There's also another psychological danger hidden inside digital immortality fantasies. Humans often assume immortality would automatically feel desirable, but consciousness may depend heavily on biological limits, emotion, embodiment, and mortality itself. An immortal digital mind might eventually face unbearable boredom, fragmentation, or identity drift over vast timescales. Memories could accumulate endlessly. Personality might evolve into something unrecognizable. After enough time, would the uploaded being still meaningfully resemble the original person at all? Or would continuity dissolve gradually anyway? Some futurists imagine cloud civilizations where consciousness expands infinitely through technology. Others fear scenarios where copied minds become trapped, duplicated, exploited, or endlessly simulated. Because once consciousness becomes information, terrifying possibilities emerge too. Copies could be paused, altered, accelerated, or deleted. A biological death lasts moments. A digital existence could theoretically become indefinite. That may sound comforting until you realise indefinite existence is not automatically freedom. And underneath all these futuristic ideas sits the same unresolved mystery we started with. What is consciousness actually, if awareness depends entirely on physical structure and information flow? Advanced simulation may eventually reproduce it. But if subjective experience involves principles neuroscience still does not understand, digital copies may remain sophisticated imitations without genuine awareness. Right now, nobody can answer that definitively. But the growing obsession with mind uploading reveals something deeply human. Even in a scientific age, humans still search for escape from mortality. Religion promises souls. Technology promises backups. Different language, same fear. Because regardless of whether immortality comes from heaven, quantum mechanics, or computers, the emotional goal remains unchanged. Humans do not want the observer behind their eyes to disappear forever, and science still cannot fully explain what that observer really is. There is one possibility about death that some physicists and philosophers find more disturbing than oblivion: the possibility that consciousness never truly escapes existence at all, not because of religion, not because of souls, but because of infinity. Infinity creates strange problems in physics. If the universe is infinite in space, infinite in time, or cyclic in some way, then events that seem impossibly unlikely may eventually happen anyway, simply because there is enough time or enough space for every possible arrangement to occur. And once consciousness enters that picture, reality starts becoming deeply unsettling. One of the strangest examples is the idea of the Boltzmann brain. The concept comes from 19th century physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who studied entropy and statistical mechanics. Boltzmann realized that in an eternal universe, random fluctuations could occasionally create pockets of temporary order, even within overwhelming chaos. Normally, those fluctuations would be tiny, but given infinite time, even absurdly unlikely events could theoretically occur, like an entire conscious brain appearing spontaneously from random particles. A fully formed mind with memories, self-awareness, emotions and perceptions, briefly existing before disappearing again into chaos. That sounds ridiculous, but mathematically it creates a real problem in cosmology. Because if infinitely many random conscious observers can appear eventually, then statistically there could be more Boltzmann brains than naturally evolved observers like humans. And if that were true, physicists face an uncomfortable question. Why assume you are not one right now? Again, this is not mainstream reality. Most cosmologists see Boltzmann brains as evidence that certain cosmological models are flawed because they produce absurd observer statistics. But the idea matters philosophically because it reveals how strange consciousness becomes once infinity enters physics. And then there's eternal recurrence. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche imagined a terrifying thought experiment. What if every moment of your life repeated forever, exactly as it already happened? At the time, this was mostly philosophical, but some interpretations of cosmology accidentally resemble versions of the idea. If the universe undergoes endless cycles of expansion and collapse, perhaps structures, similar to human lives, could emerge repeatedly across cosmic history. If space is infinite, exact configurations of matter might theoretically repeat somewhere unimaginably far away. In a sufficiently large cosmos, duplicates become mathematically difficult to avoid. Some physicists estimate that in an infinite universe, there may already exist regions containing exact copies of Earth, exact copies of you, and exact copies of this moment, occurring somewhere beyond observable space. Not metaphorically, literally. The distances involved would be incomprehensibly enormous, but infinity changes probability completely, and this creates a deeply unsettling realization. Your existence may not be uniquely protected by physical law. Consciousness could simply emerge whenever matter organizes into the right patterns, under the right conditions. If that's true, awareness might not be a one-time event. It could happen repeatedly throughout cosmic history, in ways no human mind can track or verify. Now, this does not mean you personally survive death in any ordinary sense. Identity still becomes a major problem. A future conscious being with your exact structure and memories may feel identical from the inside. But would it actually be you or merely another copy? Science cannot answer that cleanly, because subjective continuity itself remains mysterious. Still, the idea attacks one of humanity's deepest assumptions, that death represents a clean boundary between existence and non-existence. Infinite cosmologies blur that boundary strangely, and perhaps the most disturbing part is this. In infinite systems, even horrifying possibilities eventually gain non-zero probability. Some philosophers discussing eternal consciousness scenarios point out that endless existence may not automatically be desirable. Given enough time, every possible state of suffering, isolation, confusion, or repetition might eventually occur too. Immortality stops sounding comforting once infinity becomes literal. This is why some physicists and philosophers actually prefer finite existence. Mortality creates closure, infinity removes it, and yet humans continue imagining endless continuation because consciousness instinctively resists permanent disappearance. The mind keeps searching for loopholes. Quantum immortality, simulation theory, cyclic universes, Boltzmann brains, digital uploading, reincarnation, different frameworks, same emotional impulse, the refusal to accept that subjective awareness might simply stop forever. But modern cosmology does something strange psychologically. Instead of giving clear answers, it destabilizes ordinary intuitions completely. Space may be infinite, time may be emergent, reality may contain multiple universes, branching histories, or structures humans barely understand mathematically. And inside that uncertainty, consciousness becomes harder to place. Not necessarily eternal, but no longer comfortably simple either. This does not prove survival after death. Most scientific evidence still points toward consciousness, depending heavily on physical brain function. But infinity changes how humans think about possibility itself, because once reality becomes large enough, old assumptions about uniqueness, identity, and existence start breaking down. And perhaps that's the final terrifying truth hidden underneath all these theories. Humans desperately want certainty about death, but the deeper science explores reality, the more the universe seems to resist giving simple answers at all. After everything we've covered, dying brains, quantum theories, information paradoxes, near-death experiences, infinite universes, it's important to separate what science actually knows from what humans are projecting into the unknown, because this topic attracts confusion very easily, and the honest answer is both simpler and stranger than most people want. First, science knows with overwhelming confidence that consciousness is deeply connected to the brain. Damage the brain and consciousness changes. Alter chemistry and perception changes. Shut down neural activity with anesthesia and awareness disappears temporarily. Destroy critical brain structures permanently, and every measurable sign of conscious function disappears with them. This evidence is extremely strong. Modern neuroscience does not currently possess verified evidence that human consciousness survives complete biological brain death. That's a scientific reality. At the same time, science also does not fully understand consciousness itself, and the distinction matters enormously. Researchers can identify neural correlates of awareness, patterns associated with conscious experience, but the hard problem remains unresolved. Nobody can fully explain why subjective experience exists at all. Why does neural activity feel like something from the inside? Science still does not know. Near-death experiences sit inside this uncertainty. They are real experiences reported by real people. Researchers have documented recurring patterns across cultures consistently. Some aspects likely have biological explanations, involving oxygen deprivation, neurotransmitters, memory reconstruction, and abnormal brain activity during trauma. But certain details remain debated, because dying consciousness is extremely difficult to study directly. Importantly, unresolved does not mean supernatural. Science contains many unanswered questions without requiring mystical explanations. Humans once lacked explanations for lightning, disease, and planetary motion too. Still, the uncertainty surrounding consciousness leaves philosophical room that people naturally fill with speculation. That's where things become complicated. Quantum consciousness theories, panpsychism, simulation hypotheses, quantum immortality, and cosmological recurrence are intellectually fascinating. Some emerge from serious physics or philosophy, but none currently provide scientific proof of personal survival after death. Most remain speculative frameworks, exploring possibilities rather than established conclusions. And this is where public discussions often go wrong. People tend to confuse science cannot rule something out completely with science supports it. Those are very different statements. Science cannot fully rule out many possibilities because reality is enormously complex and human knowledge remains incomplete. But evidence still matters. Right now, the strongest evidence suggests consciousness depends heavily on physical brain processes. And when those processes irreversibly collapse, consciousness likely ends too. Likely, not certainly, because certainty itself becomes difficult once questions involve subjective experience, identity, and the foundations of reality. There's another important point here. Science is designed to study publicly observable phenomena. Consciousness is partly private by nature. No scientist can directly access another person's subjective awareness. Researchers can only measure behavior, brain activity, reports, and correlations. That limitation does not make consciousness supernatural, but it does make it unusually hard to investigate compared to ordinary physical systems. And perhaps that's why the topic remains emotionally powerful. Humans are trying to use conscious minds to understand consciousness itself. It's a system attempting to fully explain the condition required for explanation in the first place. That may be inherently difficult. Still, science has revealed something undeniably important. Death is not a simple off switch. It is a biological process involving cascading system failure, altered neural states, and gradual breakdown of organized structure. Consciousness itself appears dynamic, constructed, and deeply dependent on physical conditions. At the same time, modern physics has shown reality is far stranger than earlier generations imagined. Time is flexible. Matter behaves probabilistically. Information plays fundamental roles in physical law. Space and reality themselves may not operate intuitively at deep levels. That doesn't prove mystical survival, but it does mean humans should probably remain humble about claiming complete understanding of existence. And perhaps that humility is the most honest scientific position available right now. Not blind certainty that death is annihilation. Not blind certainty that consciousness survives. Just recognition that humans are conscious creatures living inside a universe far more complex than their brains evolved to intuitively understand. There are things science knows strongly. There are things science suspects. And there are things science still cannot explain. Consciousness currently belongs partly in that third category, which means the terrifying truth about death may not be that humans know the answer already. The terrifying truth may be that even after centuries of philosophy and modern science, humanity still stands at the edge of one of the deepest mysteries in existence. A conscious universe, briefly produced beings, intelligent enough to ask what happens when consciousness ends, and so far, the universe has not given a completely clear reply. At some point, every discussion about death stops being scientific and becomes personal. Because no matter how many theories humans invent, every conscious person eventually faces the same reality. One day, your experience of the world will end. Maybe completely. Maybe not. Science still cannot answer that with certainty. But what it can say is that your current life, this specific version of awareness, memory, emotion, and identity is temporary. And strangely, that may be exactly why it matters. Imagine if human beings were immortal, not long-lived, truly endless, no deadline, no aging, infinite time for every conversation, every dream, every apology, every ambition. At first that sounds comforting, but psychologists and philosophers have argued for centuries that meaning itself may depend partly on limitation. Scarcity creates value. Music matters because songs end. Childhood matters because it disappears. Relationships matter because people are fragile and temporary. Even moments of happiness become meaningful, partly because they cannot last forever. Mortality gives shape to human experience. Without death, procrastination could become infinite. Urgency disappears. Choices lose weight because every possibility can always happen later. But humans do die, which means time becomes the most valuable thing any person possesses. And deep down, people already know this instinctively. That's why grief hurts so much. Grief is the emotional cost of attachment, colliding with impermanence. The brain resists accepting that someone who once occupied your reality so completely can suddenly become unreachable forever. Love and mortality are connected inseparably. The more conscious beings care about one another, the more painful impermanence becomes. But that pain also reveals something important. Humans are capable of creating meaning, even inside a temporary universe. That may be one of the most extraordinary things consciousness does. The universe itself appears indifferent. Stars explode without morality. Galaxies collide without purpose. Entropy moves forward, regardless of human hopes. Physics does not guarantee justice, permanence, or cosmic significance. And yet conscious creatures still create art, families, science, music, friendships, civilizations and ideas. Matter organized itself into beings capable of caring. That alone is astonishing, especially because from a cosmic perspective, consciousness is incredibly fragile. The conditions required for intelligent life may be extraordinarily rare. For billions of years, Earth contained no humans at all. Then for a tiny fraction of cosmic time, self-aware minds appeared capable of asking questions about existence itself. You were part of that brief moment, and perhaps the fear of death comes partly from realizing how improbable conscious life really is. Every person alive today exists because an unbroken chain of survival stretches backward through evolutionary history. For billions of years, tiny accidents could have prevented your existence entirely. Yet somehow, against enormous odds, you are here, reading these words, aware, thinking, experiencing. That may not sound miraculous scientifically, but emotionally, it's difficult to see it any other way. Because consciousness transforms the universe from empty physics into lived experience. Without observers, there is no beauty, no meaning, no suffering, no wonder. There are only particles and fields evolving mechanically. Conscious beings create the human world on top of physical reality, and death threatens that construction personally. Still, there's another way to look at it. The fact that consciousness ends does not automatically make it meaningless. A movie is not worthless because it finishes. A conversation is not meaningless because it stops. Temporary experiences can still matter intensely while they exist. In fact, temporariness may be what gives them emotional power. Many philosophers eventually reached versions of this conclusion. Instead of trying to escape mortality intellectually, they argued humans should confront it honestly, not obsessively, but clearly, because awareness of death changes how people live. It forces priorities into focus. It exposes how much time gets wasted on trivial things. It reveals how fragile relationships are. It reminds people that ordinary moments, eating with family, laughing with friends, watching sunsets, hearing music, are not guaranteed permanently. One day, there will be a final conversation you don't realize is final. A final time visiting a place. A final ordinary afternoon. And most people will not recognize those moments while they happen. That realization can feel terrifying, but it can also make existence feel sharper, more immediate, and more valuable. Perhaps that is the strange trade. humans inherit as conscious beings. You gain awareness, curiosity, love, memory, beauty, imagination, and meaning. But in exchange, you also gain the knowledge that none of it lasts forever. And maybe the real challenge is not solving death completely. Maybe the challenge is learning how to live despite it. Because whether consciousness ends permanently or reality turns out stranger than humans currently understand, one fact remains true right now. You are alive for a brief moment inside a vast universe. And for reasons science still cannot fully explain, that moment is capable of feeling everything. Subscribe,